Hi everyone. My name is Imran Valodia, and my job here today is to kind of introduce the session and to say how pleased we are to have you all involved. So welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us for this half-day session. I think our kind of South African Constitution kind of really implores us to think about two kind of questions. The first is, what is our long-term view of what South African society should of what South African society should look like, and secondly, what is the pathway for us to get from the place that we're at to that vision of a kind of truly free and a truly democratic society. A kind of absolutely key element of that pathway is kind of questions of budgets and questions of fiscal policy. And I say that because it's really in the making of budgets. It's in the making of how we tax our citizens, and it's in the making of how we make choices about how to spend those resources. That really the crux of a democratic society is built. There is something of an irony in South Africa in that although we kind of refer kind of extensively in our public discourse to kind of questions that are related to constitutionalism, kind of questions related to kind of democracy, and we fight sort of pretty kind of rigorously about some kind of aspects of government policy choices. It does seem to me fair to say that the kind of arguments that we have about kind of questions about how we spend our resources doesn't get enough enough air in the public discourse. And it's really with that in mind that kind of SCI has kind of invested a large amount of resources in a public economics program, because we really believe that these questions of taxation and kind of questions of public expenditure are at the core of the debate about democracy and the debate about inequality. So the seminar today is to share with you some of the findings of the work that's been done in this team, and I'm kind of really pleased that Michael Sachs, kind of Arabo Awinu, and kind of Olwetu are able to share with us today some of the work that's been done on the 2022 budget. So we have three sessions. The first session, which Mamokete is going to chair, is on the fiscal context and kind of broad expenditure choices that have been made. We'll then, from about 10:15, zoom kind of into questions of health and social grants. And that session is going to be chaired by Zukiswa Kota. We'll have a short break and then kind of shift into the important area of education spending. And we kind of really pleased to have Brown Fleisch here to chair that session. So with that, let me then pass on to our chair for the first session. And like kind of all of you, I'm sure we're all looking forward to a kind of informative and exciting day. So over to you.
Thank you very much for joining us for the session, and I'm very happy to be here to discuss this very, very important topic, which has probably not been sufficiently, what's the word I'm looking for, sufficiently attended to, I think, in the public discourse. So, before I go any further, I'm going to hand over to Michael Sachs, who's going to present the results of the study that we will then discuss after this.
So thanks very much, and I think we're joined by, we have here for the panel discussion on this, Gilad Isaacs from the Institute for Economic Justice, and I think online we should be having Edgar Sishi, the DDG of Budget Office in the Treasury, and Dumisani Jantjies from the Parliamentary Budget Office. So welcome to you all. I think this first report that we're issuing this year is about the budget issued in February. And there's a sense that we may be late for discussion on the budget, but the way we think about it is that we are early for the discussion of the next budget. Because our premise is that public deliberation can influence budget choices, but it needs to be consistent and occur year after year. Our premise is also that the numbers given in the budget reflect real policy intentions of government. We have policy made by narrative, by policy statements and reports, which is important, but the budget is almost unique in forcing government to declare its policy intentions in numbers. And the advantage of numbers is that they are either one or two. They cannot be both. And so the budget forces government to be very explicit on what it's trying to achieve. So in this first session, I want to go through the fiscal context and some of the spending choices that are implied by the numbers in the budget. So we usually think about the fiscal crisis that a country faces, a sovereign crisis, as an event of default on debt. So we see Argentina or Zambia recently facing debt default, and this is how we think of a debt crisis. But the actual debt crisis is not something in the distant future. It is something that is happening every day and right now. And that is the crowding out that results from the increase in the burden of the debt, which is the debt servicing costs, which crowd out the space for social spending. There's various crowding out effects that happen that are associated with debt. The one that is best known is discussions about whether public investment crowds out private investment. But that's not really the issue we're interested in here. We are interested in the fact that fiscal risk, high fiscal risk, raises interest rates throughout the economy and therefore itself becomes a constraint on economic growth. But more important than that, debt payments, the interest payments you make on debt are really rent transferred out of your economy to foreign investors and the financial sector. And as a matter of arithmetic, unless taxes rise to cover these rising debt service costs, social spending must fall to accommodate the rising debt costs. Borrowing more to offset this actually only makes it worse. So we can see in the graph that is in front of you that in the 2000s and the 1990s, it's showing real per capita growth. So the growth in spending in real terms per South African. And we see in the 1990s, we had very high real per capita growth rates of about 8 to 10%, sustained over a very long period of time with negative falling debt service costs. But from around 2000 to 2012, economic conditions changed, and you had this sudden rise in debt service costs. And the way government responded to that was to constrain the growth of real spending per capita. And real spending per capita since 2012 has been effectively zero. So public services have been under intense fiscal pressure for a decade. The way Treasury has set about responding to the fiscal crisis is to suggest that we're going to have, in the next 2 or 3 years, a very large contraction in real per capita spending. If you compare it to the contraction in 1997, 98, and 99 associated with the gear policy, what we're looking at now in the budget documents is an even larger fiscal contraction. And that is the approach Treasury is taking to reduce this growth of debt service costs, which we're arguing here is a problem that they must respond to. The first response that was trying to contain fiscal pressures was an expenditure ceiling. So each year in the MTEF, Treasury set out how much are we going to spend in the next few years. The spending ceiling succeeded in containing growth, as I showed in the previous graph. Growth of spending has been very contained for a decade, but it did not succeed in consolidating the fiscus. In 2020, at the beginning of 2020, Treasury announced a change in strategy. Whereas up to then, the approach of fiscal policy has been to cut spending in the far outer years of the framework, what we call backloading the fiscal consolidation to the future, in the hope that by the time the fiscal consolidation is necessary, economic growth would have risen to and conditions would be better to enable that fiscal consolidation. In 2020, in February, a month before the coronavirus pandemic, Treasury announced a change in strategy, saying they're going to front load the fiscal consolidation. But what has happened since then is that effectively, in the context of the pandemic, the expenditure ceiling has ceased to be an effective fiscal anchor. So in the graph on the left, you can see the announced trajectory of spending in simple nominal rand terms in various budget documents. So if I compare the October 2020 statement, had this spending path, but then the budget review that followed not 6 months later had a significant increase in the spending path. Again, in the 2021 October, we had this spending path, the dashed line. That was followed by adding somewhere in the region of 30 billion in 1 year, 40 billion in another year, and 100 billion in another year. So over the MTEF. So the pandemic has forced Treasury to accommodate very large increases in expenditure. What you see on the right-hand side then is the path going forward in successive documents. And essentially what we have had is a path where spending pressures are accommodated in the current year, but next year we are told there will be this sudden fiscal shock and expenditure will reduce significantly. So in the MTBPS of 2020, that's October 2020, the idea was that in 2021, we would have this large negative growth in spending. That didn't materialize. Instead, growth in spending continued largely along the path it was going on. And in the following MTBPS of 2021, we were told that the sudden contraction of expenditure would happen in 2022. But that also didn't happen. In 2022, expenditure was accommodated, and we're now being told that the sudden contraction of expenditure will happen next year in 2023. So we have a pattern over the last 3 years of accommodating spending pressures in the current year, and Treasury has added significantly to the budget to accommodate spending pressures for compensation of employees. It's added significantly to accommodate the COVID SRD grant and the presidential employment stimulus, but at the same time telling us that next year there's going to be this sudden, sharp consolidation. So this short, sharp fiscal shock that is promised year after year has so far not materialized. And if you look at the spending path by what kind of input government is purchasing, you see this kind of picture. First of all, compensation of employees, which is the black line here. This is showing growth, annual average growth of these budget aggregates. Compensation of employees has been contained quite a lot in the last few years. And you can see it's fallen considerably from the highs it was around 2010. Since about 2013, the growth of compensation has been contained. In 2020, government, as we know, walked out of a collective bargaining agreement, and the growth in compensation in that year was about 1%. But in 2022, or in 2021, we're looking at a significant increase in compensation growth. In recent years, what we've seen is compensation contained and a surge in social transfer spending. And this has been offset by a collapse in capital spending, which can be seen in the yellow line here. And this is prior to the COVID pandemic. What is being set out in the current documents, the current budget plan, is that wage and social pressures are accommodated in 2021 and 2022, but then there's a very large contraction in 2023. We also see an attempt at a sudden surge of capital spending in this year, but again, a contraction of capital spending next year. So all elements of the budget contract significantly next year. And then the idea is that spending will be put on a path of moderate growth, more or less in line with CPI. So that's the fiscal context in a sense, and it leaves us with an ambiguity. Because on the one hand, Treasury is promising this short, sharp fiscal shock next year, but it's not clear that that will in fact happen, that wages will be cut next year, or that the COVID SRD grant will be withdrawn, or that the presidential employment stimulus will be withdrawn. The budget assumes they will be, and as we will see later, if they're not, this shock will not happen. But what then are the spending choices? What is the impact on various policy objectives given by the spending choices in that fiscal context? The first point to make is that in overall terms, spending is very much aligned with constitutional obligations of government. This graph is showing the annual spending by policy function over the next 3 years on average. So in education, we're looking about 300 billion being spent on average each year. And the red bars, social protection, basic education, healthcare, community development, which is essentially local government, and others are the constitutional imperatives of spending. And you can see that spending is very much focused there. That's where the bulk of spending is. The other spending obligations are economic, security, and governance obligations. And then there are two others. One is bailouts for state-owned companies, which is mainly for Eskom, which is about 25 billion per year, and debt service costs, which are now the largest single spending item and the fastest growing spending item. So what this picture tells you is that there's very limited fiscal space to reallocate spending in favor of whatever policy objectives we might have. Because unlike in many other countries, to say that we should dramatically reduce spending on defense, for instance, might not be credible in order to finance bread instead of guns, because already defense spending is quite a small share of the budget, only 50 billion against the 300 billion in basic education. The previous slide showed you the level of spending per policy objective. But what the budget tries to do, hopefully, is change the allocation of spending. And because the budget is large and spending changes very slowly, in order to understand what are the choices being proposed by the budget, we have to look at the medium-term path of spending. And that's what we're doing in this graph. It shows us in simple nominal terms the average annual growth rate of spending. So there's only one element of spending, that's community development, which is essentially local government and local infrastructure, grows faster than inflation. This line gives you CPI inflation, and only one element is growing faster than inflation. Every other element of the budget is growing slower than inflation, and so is being eroded in real terms. But there are two other elements that are growing faster than the average of the budget overall. In other words, these two elements, universities and colleges and economic development, are increasing their share of the budget. So the spending choices given in this picture are clear. We are prioritizing local government, economic infrastructure and community infrastructure, and university students. Secondly, we are reducing real spending on healthcare, social protection, and basic education, the core social services. Thirdly, we are facing very large cutbacks in policing, criminal justice, and defense. In the case of defense, actually negative growth in spending over the next few years. I should say again that these numbers assume that Treasury achieves its fiscal objectives, so that the COVID SRD grant is not continued, the presidential employment stimulus is not continued, and workers face very large cuts to their wages. So the decisions about which policies we are favoring feed directly into decisions about which spheres of government are benefiting or not benefiting from the fiscal framework. So as soon as we say we are shifting spending away from police and away from defense, that necessarily means we're shifting spending away from national government, because police and defense constitute the main activity in budget terms of national government. If we're shifting away from social services like health and education or basic education, then we're shifting away from provincial government. So very much in this budget, as has been the case for the last 10 years, we see a choice to shift in favor of local government. The local equitable share is growing at more than 9%, one of the largest and fastest growing budgets in the whole budget framework. And a question can be raised that we are therefore shifting additional resources into the sphere of government that has the most acute fiscal and operational crisis, that is facing operational collapse, that is unable to demonstrate that it is providing value for money. And we're shifting resources into that sphere of government at a time when we don't have a very clear reform agenda that articulates how are we going to resolve this operational and fiscal crisis in local government. So the report questions this decision. Going back to the fiscal context, and I think this is my last slide, that, there's something called the primary balance in the fiscal accounts. That's like the deficit, but we're excluding interest costs. And the primary balance is really the thing that drives debt stabilization, together with interest rates and underlying growth rates. And what we have there is the primary deficit in black over the last few years leading into COVID was around 1% or 1.5% of GDP. We went into COVID with a very large shock to the deficit. And then the kind of lighter bars here, or these bars here, are representing the path set out in the budget. Now, if we make all of the assumptions set out in the budget about revenue and economic growth and we retain all of the assumptions, but we just change 3 assumptions about spending, we get this other path of the primary balance. The 3 assumptions we're making for that path is simply that compensation budgets grow at CPI, at the forecast CPI at the time of the budget. The COVID SRD grant continues, it's not withdrawn, and it grows at CPI. And the presidential employment stimulus also continues and grows at CPI. And if we make those 3 adjustments to the spending path, we end up with a primary balance that doesn't close, that remains higher than it was before COVID. The IMF estimated in its Article 4 paper issued in January that to keep the ratio of public debt to GDP unchanged from 2021, we need a primary surplus of 2.1% of GDP. And we can see that even in Treasury's own forecast, we don't achieve that primary surplus. But the more likely alternate scenario that we're presenting here leaves us stuck with this primary deficit of 1% of GDP. So that's the context of fiscal policy and the overall spending choices. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Mamokete. Just the last slide is just summarizing to say what effectively are the choices we're making here. Is to continue growing spending on local government, economic infrastructure, and subsidies for students in higher education. Reduce real spending on basic education, healthcare, and social protection. Substantially cut back on spending for police, criminal justice, and defense. And of course, in de facto, we are increasing permanent commitments for new social grants, public employment programs, and universities. And de facto, we are accommodating wage bill pressures as they arise and hoping that we'll be able to contain them in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that that summary and that presentation. I think there's quite a lot that went into that, and there's quite a lot of information there. And I don't think we will manage to get through probably all the important points in this very short discussion, but hopefully, we make a dent. I think the report was fantastic, Michael and Letu, and who's the other person that worked on it? And Karabo made an amazing, put amazing work into this, and it shows. So I would like now to just find out if the other panelists are online. I think Edgar and, is Edgar online, and Dumisani? So how we're going to conduct this, we'll give each panelist an opportunity to make their initial comments. I think everybody gets about 5 minutes, so don't go over, and then we will bring it back to a discussion, starting with the person that's in, actually no, let's start with Edgar. We'll go from the screen to the room and then back to the screen. Edgar, what would be your comments on what Michael has presented?
Hi, good morning. I hope I'm audible, and that I was warned that in these things that can be a terrible echo, so I'm sorry if there's an echo. And also thank you for accommodating me with a virtual arrangement. Unfortunately, I had other meetings in Pretoria that made it very difficult for me to go up and down. Look, I think the report and the presentation makes some very important and useful points. One of them is the fact that there are several very difficult considerations when we think about the trends for non-interest expenditure over the next while. I'll just, in 1 or 2 minutes, just indicate some of them. When we think about these things, we've also considered the fact that one of the reasons why the expenditure ceiling is not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why the expenditure ceiling was not successful is because we had been somewhat a little bit over-optimistic with our growth projections. Not a lot, but just a little bit. And I think we have become a bit more, I would say, a bit more on the pessimistic side now than we have been in the past. And we're taking a more cautious approach with the growth projections. Specifically, we have generally taken a more prudent stance with respect to fiscal multipliers, but also you will have noticed that we're not quite as positive as we had been in the past. In other words, prior to 2020, with the approach to the reform agenda. So if you look at the scenarios that we publish in the budget review, the success of the growth agenda, which includes structural reforms, which includes things like some of the reform items that have been stalled on the energy side, on the ICT side, and so forth. We have taken to putting those in the upside scenario rather than the baseline scenario. And so that's one important consideration. The second thing is that we have also considered the poor effectiveness and efficiency of the spending in the priority areas. The fact that we do have significant amounts of spending in some of these sectors, but the places where it's going and the way that it is being spent still leaves quite a bit to be desired. So we think there's opportunities, particularly in the capital program for improved efficiency. There's a lot of leakages in that regard, where even though there's a lot of pressure, which is a good thing, to add to capital expenditure, there's improvements that need to happen there that don't necessarily require additional funds. The second point I just want to make is in respect of debt service costs. Debt service costs, Michael is correct, are a critical part of the strategy, but they're not the only thing that we think about. The other thing that's very, very problematic is the huge amount of contingent liabilities that we have, particularly those emanating from state-owned companies. The contingent liabilities are now, for this year, estimated at around 1.2 trillion rands. So that is kind of, I guess, a sword of Damocles that hangs over the fiscus that's not in the numbers. But when we think about the numbers and the path forward, we have to think about those things. And there is an obligation to somewhat try and keep our powder dry in that regard, because the likelihood of materialization is actually growing by the day of those contingencies. And then the final thing I just want to say is that, actually the second final thing I want to say is Michael talks about the spending ceiling and the pushing out of fiscal consolidation. I mean, it's true, but I think he misses the fact that in the last 2 years, changes in spending that have led to consolidation being pushed out have actually happened as a result of exogenous factors in the middle of the year. Obviously, in 2020, we had all sorts of things happening as a result of the COVID outbreak. But also last year in 2021, if the unrest in KZN and Gauteng had not happened, along with the lockdown that was implemented in July for the Delta variant, but mostly the KZN and Gauteng unrest. If that had not happened in July, we would have easily kept to our plan. The spending ceiling that increased as a result of the KZN and Gauteng unrest explains the entirety of the variance between the 2021 budget and the actual outcomes in March 2022. Had that not happened, we would have actually stuck to our consolidation plan quite easily, in fact, because as you would have seen in the Section 32 report that was published last month, government underspent significantly. We reported about 17 billion rands of underspending by national departments, including basic education was one of the big ones that underspent, and 11 billion rands underspent by the 9 provinces. So, as I said, had it not been for the events in July last year, we could have easily kept to our plans, not a problem at all. I do want to make one last comment in that I think obviously a lot of what has happened over the last while has been the revenue windfalls, and the report, the not so much the presentation, but the report does highlight this, including obviously the benefits from corporate taxes in the mining industry. But I do think, as I've said, that the spending restraint outside of exogenous factors has been quite good in government over the last year to a year and a half. And I think that had it not been for those things, obviously we've been doing a lot better in terms of the fiscal accounts. But the tax story is, of course, a big story. Our approach to that story has been that we need to look at opportunities for broadening the tax base. That's a much more important issue for us than tax rates, which tend to be emphasized in some cases in the report, particularly the corporate tax rate reduction that we made. We're interested in the real money that comes in rather than the rate. And if you have a rate that is an outlier compared to your peers, and where the effective rate is much, much lower than the statutory rate, it's more important to look at base broadening than the rate itself. But anyway, let me stop there. I think those are the comments that I just wanted to make from my side. But otherwise, thank you for the presentation.
Thanks a lot, Edgar, for your contributions. I'd like to give an opportunity to Gilad Isaacs to add his comment.
Excellent. Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation. I think it's a really useful paper. I agree with Michael's opening point that these conversations need to be had on an ongoing basis. We generally see a flurry of activity in February and in October. So I think it's actually great to have a paper on our budget come out in between those and allow for sustained engagement. I think there's a number of valuable elements which push public discourse. And I'm going to point to three. One of which Michael's covered, which is speaking about the series of inconsistencies and unrealistic assumptions which one could argue has been made. Another two which are made quite strongly in the paper, but less so in the opening input here. The first is that the paper does not stick its head in the sand in the way which we see from National Treasury and from large parts of our business press. It makes very clear that fiscal consolidation will have a negative impact on economic growth and on service delivery. Some quotes, for instance, because this wasn't covered. If implemented, the contraction in government spending next year will have further regressive consequences and slow our pace of economic recovery. This across the board contraction is likely to be disruptive to service delivery and impose negative fiscal impulses on economic growth. And there are a range of other quotes, including a note that they will widen inequality. And I think this is really important, so we don't have a conversation which pretends, as our budget does often, that not entirely, that these choices can be made without negative impact. I appreciate it. I think it furthers public discourse, and Michael's alluded to this in the input, but the paper's quite firm on this, that there's been a lack of planning in how to actually accommodate these choices made. In a number of instances, the paper says XYZ's being done in X sector, and there's no plan for how this will actually be accommodated within the service delivery and other objectives. So I think those are just some valuable envelope pushing aspects which I wanted to add. I think there's an area where I would have pushed Michael and his team to do to see a little bit more of. The first is on a distributional impact, which I think for a center like SCIS would be like valuable input. It hints at this. So, for instance, there's a and by this I mean a concern in particular for inequality. So, for instance, one line which I think is useful is it speaks about tax cuts and says instead of taking the opportunity to signal a sharing of a burden of fiscal consolidation, the budget tax measures seek to ease the burden on corporate monopolies, affluent households, and fossil fuels. So there are instances where it looks at where the burdens lie, but I think that this is an important area which could be elaborated on. The paper does say that there will be further work on spending and on revenue. That this is about spending and there'll be further work on revenue. But as Michael's done in the input, it does still frame the paper almost and the spending choices against the issue of debt and against the issue of a constrained revenue environment, right? That's an overall framing. And I think that there's ways in which this could be nuanced further. And in debt, I think there's three key elements which determine one's debt path. The first is the overall quantum, where the budget puts us at just under 70%. Now, this is completely in line with international norms. The emerging market and developing economies average before COVID was 66% and is significantly higher now. The projected primary balances, so how much we're in debt each year or in deficit excluding interest costs, which Michael showed, is also completely normal. In G20s countries this year, it was larger. In emerging markets before the crisis, it was almost 3 times larger. So where South Africa is actually out of sync is in interest rate costs, right? The amount which we pay on that debt. And I think that's a part of our debt conversation and what we can do about that, which we're avoiding. And I think we could push on that. I'll wrap up now. The importance, I think, of dealing with revenue and spending simultaneously is that these are interconnected. I know Michael likes to emphasize debt as a transfer from taxpayers to bondholders, but the net effect of debt and its distributional consequences depends both on that debt and how it is being spent. If it's being spent effectively on appropriate social services, then its net distributional effect is not necessarily one from taxpayers to bondholders. On the tax side, I'll skip over, besides to say that I think, in my words, not the words of the paper, but it points to quite firmly the indefensible and nonsensical decisions made around the reductions in corporate income tax and tax relief for the wealthy. The last thing I think I would have liked to have seen, Michael, is potentially an unpacking of why you think conceptually these choices have been made, right? What is it about the underlying philosophical, theoretical, or ideological choices which leads to this? I think the conclusion I generally agree with, that clear policy choices need to be made, that we can't kind of cut everywhere but cut nowhere, and kind of carry on in this kind of middle ground way that we have now. I think the last sentence of this paper lets Treasury off the hook a bit, right? Saying that unless we make correct policy, the way we allocate funds won't alter the economy. Okay, that's a poor paraphrase. Okay, but the choices in the budget and National Treasury's role is fundamental to what those policy choices actually are. So I don't think we can let them off the hook quite extensively as that closing salvo. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Gilad, for those comments. I'd like to now hand over to Dumisani Jantjies from the Parliamentary Budget Office to make his initial comments.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Chris. Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. I'd love to be there in person. I think conditions that it is going to be. I mean, we've seen certain areas of crime category, in certain categories actually worsening recently, in particular vulnerable members of society being affected more disproportionately, but also around education. We're seeing actually that the metric results, 2020 metric results have shown that actually the country still lags behind in reaching some of the quality education aspirations set ourselves for. I've seen a lot of social service protests in local government areas, which really disproportionately impact different households along the racial, gender, and inequality lines, because really it's predicated upon the set of this relationship across these different social groups. Again, governance issues and financial issues, local government really impact on service delivery in particular. So what we also trying to emphasize here in this discussion is really understanding that some of the proposal that were made in February about our macroeconomic situation have really actually deteriorated quite worsened, and this is expected to continue over time. When we look at how the COVID-19 continued to disrupt economies globally, but also in South Africa, look at the strict, as colleagues have mentioned, strict lockdown pressures and so on. And looking at the Russian invasion and continued on and expected accelerated supply chain disruptions and global shortages global shortages and price of food that are increasing, but also largely some of the issues around the climate change effects on our societies. We looked at example that Edgar mentioned around KwaZulu-Natal, floods, which talks to really healthcare, education, and economic activities that gets affected, and the question is how much of these choices would continue to support such societies as we look at them. But also the issue of security of energy is a big issue since rapid increase in incidents of load shedding, which affect service delivery in this regard. In a sense, our analysis were concerned about the low investment in unemployment and level of unemployment in the economy, and our sense that spending choices that are made in the same time inadequately address these concerns. And look at some of the points raised in the budget there. There's an acknowledgement that the fiscal outlook and continuing poor levels of growth and inequality. However, there's a sense that there are limited details in how the government is going to really build resilience for future crises. And the point we emphasize again, we talk about debts and deficits, and is that is really the lower budget deficit or lower debt levels sufficient factors to improve macroeconomic stability over the long term. And really coming back to issues of structural reform, we've seen actually evidence does show that the government's structural reforms are slow and to some extent inadequate to boost growth and achieve meaningful macro stability over a long time. Our economy remains concentrated both on the market, wealth individuals, institutional investors, and financialized non-financial operations, and not adequately allocating money towards real investment. And really, this also talks to a point around planned infrastructure that we are worried or concerned that it's very much dependent on the role of the private sector in this regard. And within this context, really, it's clear that some of the spending choices are likely to have limited effects on realizing government's fiscal objectives, and also some of the economic and social challenges that South Africa and our society is facing. I think the issue of looking at economies within the context that we are in now is the fact that the society and also many of the sectors of the economy require some much support, particularly when looking at the cost of living, which is even so high to low income households, meaning households require more need support over the period of time. And also, lastly, talking about the issues around the small medium entities requiring more support to withstand inflationary pressures, high energy bills, and low economic demand that is likely to continue over the medium term. So I think, the approach wanted to say, really to emphasize that the spending choice itself should really look into some of the economic activities or economic context or social context that we're in. And in our sense, it hasn't gone far enough to address some of these concerns. And more so that the macroeconomic conditions, both globally and domestically, are likely to deteriorate further. I think I'm going to stop there. I'm going to give my comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that input, Dumisani. The audio was patchy in places, but I think we got the gist of your view. So we've had three quite different inputs to the discussion so far. So Edgar coming back with, I suppose, the Treasury view of the issues that are on the table, speaks about growth projections and that they're a lot more conservative around that relative to the posture that Treasury adopted before, speaks about improved efficiency in expenditure, the worry that is embedded in very high levels of contingent liabilities, and talking about the fact that, fiscal outcomes have looked worse than where you started, but that was due to unforeseen circumstances that occur mid-process. And a few comments also there around revenue windfalls and taxation. I suppose speaking to Michael's view that, the tax changes that were sort of introduced in the last document were, misaligned, so to speak, and Edgar saying, we're looking to broaden the tax base versus increase tax rates. Gilad came through with a very different contribution as well. Likes the fact that Michael and the SCIS report highlights the inconsistencies and unrealistic assumptions that are embedded in the budget, and highlights also that there is a trade-off between consolidation and growth in service delivery. And I think also highlights the bits of the report that he thinks were a bit inadequate. And I'd like to hear Michael's responses, I suppose, to this as well, around, that you insufficiently talk to the inequality or addressing, the distributional impacts within the budget process, and also that the framing expenditure as constrained by revenue and debt needs to be a bit more nuanced. And the philosophical, ideological, or philosophical driver of these decisions as you see them, and that you letting Treasury or government more broadly off the hook. So Dumisani, I think, brings an important view also here to say, you've got to think about all of these in the context of the pressures that we see in welfare more broadly in the economy or in the country, and also in the kind of drag that we're seeing in economic growth, and how are these choices seen then in the context of the pressures that we're seeing on the macroeconomy, both domestic, because of domestic reasons and offshore reasons, as well as the pressures that we're seeing in welfare across communities more broadly. So I'd like to hand over to Michael for his initial responses to the provocations.
Thank you. No, thanks. Those were very useful inputs, and I should say this is ongoing work. In the next couple of months, we'll be continuing our focus on spending choices by looking at real resource allocation that is part of government consumption. Because you're absolutely right that there's kind of a misnomer in the national accounts. When we talk about government consumption, these are not things that are consumed by government. Government consumption is consumed by households. And in South Africa, because of the structure of our social services, government consumption is a large share of the consumption basket of the poor. So when you cut education and when you cut healthcare, you are directly reducing the resource allocation to poor households, and you're reducing their consumption basket. So I think this initial report, you're Gilad, very right that we need a more systematic focus on the distributional consequences. What we were trying to understand here is more the trying to tease out the exact spending choices, because in the cacophony of discussion after the budget, it's not clear, as you say, what is the actual proposition that's been made here. Treasury coats it with their own narrative, and it's a very important narrative. Civil society tends to respond, but sometimes we lose focus on the actual choices. So I think I'm not going to try and kind of respond to everything. I think the challenge we have, I suppose, my response to what Edgar was saying is that the challenge we're trying to highlight here is that if you look backwards at the budget numbers, you do not see a strong fiscal consolidation over the last 10 years. And instead you see, especially in the last few budgets, large additional amounts accommodating spending pressures. And we can say these additional allocations are in response to exogenous events like coronavirus pandemic or the July unrest. But in my view, they are permanent fiscal commitments. So if we just look at the compensation of employees, the trajectory of the growth of compensation of employees has been contained, but last year grew at about CPI. So the idea that compensation will grow in line with inflation in the past, and significant additional resources were added into the budget, particularly in basic education and in healthcare, specifically to accommodate compensation pressures. And then we're saying the assumption of the budget is that next year you're going to have negative growth in nominal terms of the compensation budget. So the assumption is that you're going to have a historically unprecedented wage settlement imposed by government on labor the year before an election. Again, the COVID SRD grant does not continue through cuts off in the second year of the budget, and the presidential employment stimuli. I think all of these things are permanent fiscal commitments. So if you look at this year, you see Treasury having to accommodate the pressures that are arising and being imposed on it by society, by politics, by the presidency. But in the future saying, well, that's fine, we've accommodated the pressures this year, but don't worry, next year we're gonna slash everything. And I think each year that kind of pattern repeats itself, the credibility of the claim that you're going to slash the budget next year gets eroded. And that's kind of where we are, is that I think out there in society and even in markets, there is not a strong confidence that Treasury will execute those things. Briefly on the debt and, okay, so this maybe first, this relates to when Gilad was saying, I'm letting Treasury off the hook. Really, in the last section of the document, we're making points about if you want to have a successful fiscal consolidation that has limited impact on services, you have to plan for that. You have to say, we have made a choice to constrain compensation spending and goods and services spending in basic education. Here is our plan that we're putting forward to society and to labor to limit the effect of that on basic education outcomes. But Treasury has repeated several times that the budget is going to worsen basic education outcomes. So I'm not so much letting Treasury off the hook, I think, as saying this is a broader government responsibility. Treasury cannot implement fiscal consolidation on its own without the cooperation of the rest of government. In terms of the debt issues, I mean, I'll just repeat what I think I said in the presentation, is that for me, we can look at the level of debt or the level of the deficit and say it's normal. But the truth is, as Gilad says, is that we're paying massive interest payments each year. These are crowding out social spending. We could have a debate about monetary policy, but we're not going to today. So let me leave it there.
Okay, so I just wanted to give everybody else a chance to make final comments, because I think we have 5 more minutes, to go. And I suppose, let me just do this maybe in reverse, in terms of just final comments from our panelists. I'd like to start with Dumisani. So Dumisani, my kind of question to you, if you could answer it in a minute or so, really speaks to what is Parliament's How does Parliament then incorporate, for instance, what Michael has put forward into the work that you do of holding government to account around the budget process going forward? Is there anything that you can take away from this work, and what would it be?
Thank you so much. Look, I think the timing is quite important where it is of the report, and it's very mind-stimulating. And I think, as I understand the budget process in Parliament, it allows different set of conversations to happen all the time. And I think what we have, what we have always encouraged a lot of times with the committees that we say was that, look, let us have long time before the budget itself, or before the midterm budget, where members can engage on this spending choices or engage in the budget as a whole. But also, again, from the members' point of view, from the Parliament's point of view, it's about what their constituencies are requesting from them. And as I gave that approach, that we look at finance, we ask us, yes, you have cut expenditure, you have reduced, you've increased there, you've cut there, and so on. But what is the impact on society? What is the impact on broader socio-economic aspirations we have? And I think this report really takes us quite closer to understanding that every choices that are made, they will have implications. And I think that is a very good message to take out. And I think I like the issue around whether we do make a choice, and that choice is clearly communicated. But I think for me, what's important is to say what will be the implications for broader social-economic development indicators that we seek to improve. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. I'd like to move to Gilad just as a final comment and I suppose an answer to a question. So you put in your comments that there's not enough examination, for instance, in the report of why are the choices that government making the way they're making them. So what is the philosophical or ideological driver of these decisions? If you had to put the budget in a different ideology or philosophy, what would be the key difference in terms of what we have versus what you would have? Just a few.
Okay, thanks very much. And I think this is relates to what I was going to say to Michael and team also as a closing comment, which is that I'd be really keen in future work to see an engagement with the premise with which this paper starts, which is the necessity of fiscal consolidation. This paper notes, for instance, that the UIF surplus will go back up to about 120 billion in the context of these expenditure cuts, right? And there's the commodities windfall at the moment, and there's all sorts of revenue issues, and I'd like, it would be useful for the premise upon which this starts to be engaged with. I think that the philosophical and starting points, just off the top of my head, would be there's two important things. Neoclassical economic theory would like to argue that, which this paper does not, that we can get away with fiscal consolidation without negative consequences, right? That you can have contractionary expansionism, right? And you see that, for instance, in the tax cuts, the misnomer that doing this will actually increase overall revenue through increased economic activity. Similarly, the misnomers that increased government debt by default crowds out private sector spending based on notions that there's fixed pools of financing rather than an understanding of the role of banks and financial institutions in expanding money in the economy and so on. So there's a number of underpinning assumptions about how spending and revenue raising interact with the economy, which I think are theoretically fundamentally flawed. And another critical aspect would be the engagement with the relationship between fiscal consolidation and a targeted and well thought through fiscal stimulus engagement with the aim of with the explicit growth in enhancing objective, and an engagement with the real world consequences of what fiscal consolidation has meant elsewhere. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Gilad. Final question and then closing comment from Edgar, or for Edgar. So Edgar, I'm just going to make a point that I think you, in your comments, you sort of ducked the one of the key inputs in the report, in that there are service delivery and growth trade-offs. And I think Gilad speaks to this as well, to fiscal consolidation. I don't think you spoke at all about that. And the issue that the fiscal path as is currently in the budget is unlikely to be met because there are a few unrealistic assumptions that are made, and you didn't say much to dispute that comment as well. I don't know if you could say something around those issues maybe in a minute or so, and whatever closing comment you would want to make.
In a minute. No, look, obviously, I think there's two things on fiscal consolidation and growth and the fiscal, the levels of spending. I think if you look at, there's two things. The first is that we believe we have history on our side in this regard, because if we look at the history, what we've seen is that post 2009, on average, non-interest expenditure grew by 9%. And we did not get economic growth from that increase in non-interest expenditure. The only thing we got was more debt and higher debt service costs. So when we look at the actual evidence of what happened, what we see is we see an increase. Now people will come in and they'll say, well, that's because the increase in expenditure was directed towards the wrong things. That's why you didn't get the growth. But all that proves is the fact that we need to adjust the existing expenditure envelope. It doesn't prove that you need to add more money. So I think the reality is that fiscal consolidation, particularly the baseline reductions that were implemented. Let's take a look at 2020. We were told in 2020, you're going to kill growth because of this fiscal consolidation. We didn't. 2021, yes, from a low base, but we had one of the highest growth in GDP we've had over the last decade. So our policy is quite consistent. If you believe that fiscal multipliers are low, then it also is true that a reduction in certain parts of non-interest expenditure is not going to have the negative impact on growth that it would if they're high. So we're quite consistent in our view in that regard, and that's the second thing. But as I said, history shows that increases in non-interest expenditure has not led to high growth. It's led to more debt. I think on the issue of the forward fiscal path, look, the fiscal choices, and I agree with Michael in this regard, the fiscal choices are political in this regard. The choices that are made in terms of priorities are political executive choices. They're not at their core Treasury choices. You know, they come from somewhere and they don't come from the Treasury. So I think that has to be borne in mind when you think about these things. And unfortunately, some of the choices have been a surprise and have meant changes in the numbers. A classical example, of course, is the social relief of distress as well as the presidential employment program. It was stated, not by us, but it was stated at the political level that those were temporary measures. So it seems to me that we can't go and put a budget down that says, oh no, we don't agree with the politicians. We're just going to. So I think I agree that we have to address credibility issues, but I think those credibility issues also have to be addressed at the political level. Let me end on one point by saying that there are certain things when you do budgeting where you have to consider the reality of what you've tried and it hasn't worked. Because you don't just justify the budget on philosophical grounds, you have to justify the budget on pragmatic, practical grounds. And if you have raised tax rates on the wealthiest income earners in the past and it didn't result in actual revenue, you have to go back and you have to look at things like your base. You have to look at things like what your rate is versus other jurisdictions around the world. And those are the lessons that you learn and you take that forward. So you can't have an approach that ignores the facts and ignores what's happened in the past. And what we've tried to do is we've tried to say, look, there's certain things that, we tried to do, they didn't work. We have to think again, particularly on the tax side. That's why I don't agree with the paper's assertion that the budget somehow has giveaways to the wealthiest people in the country. I think if you look at the tax relief that the budget has provided, there's no question that an increase in the income tax free threshold, a relief in fuel taxes, for example, that goes to the poorest people in the country, and that's the major parts of tax relief in this budget that is there. So let me stop there, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Dumisani. Thank you, Edgar. Thank you, Gilad and Michael, for a really interesting discussion. I could personally be here for another 2 hours, and I still wouldn't have exhausted all the various rabbit holes that I think have been put on the table by Michael and further opened up by the other people in the discussion. But we will end it here for this particular session, and I think we're 5 minutes over, whatever. So thank you guys very, very much.